we had urban guerrillas. I remember the SLA and the Weather Underground, even though I was a kid. So people don't seem to remember anything. So now it's the worst situation it's ever been. But the first thing I put down is the problem of analysis. That's number one here. Um, I would say we live in a totalitarian society, not totalitarian in the sense of Soviet Union or East Germany, but totalitarian in the sense that it is entirely dominated by a number of forces, the main one being the economy and technology, which of course are related. There's no outside to this system anymore, despite fantasies of living off the grid and that kind of thing. We live in a totalized consumer society, but people experience their lives as fragmentary. So the analyst has to talk about things from a perspective of totality to understand it, but recognizing that nobody actually lives in that totality because everybody has their individual experiences and their lives and their experience of the conditions under which they live. So, you know, I say here we live in a completely administered world and it's contradictory. The contradiction that strikes me is that our sense of individuality has been elaborated and inflated, but we live within a collective that has over time devalued considerably. And let me quickly give you an example. And I use this with my students and they hate it, but I like it. I like things like that. I show them the difference between a portrait from 1795 by Thomas Gainsborough, and I forget who this is, Lady Sarah Birmingham or whatever the hell. It doesn't matter, but it's highly individualized, and it's meant to show her importance as an aristocratic individual. And it's awfully lavish. You can't see much of it, but just the painting of the dress alone is remarkable. And then like 120 years later, you have this Duchamp painting called The Nude Descending a Staircase from 1912, in which all traces of individuality have been removed. And it's strictly an anatomical model at best. And he tries to duplicate the look of sequence photography and film. You know, and at that point, it's right before the first mechanized war, World War I, increasingly vicious warfare, where you would say that the individual's importance has been lessened a great deal, both by mass society and by forces that can easily destroy. So what's the relevance of that to paranoia? Well, if you live in that condition where you're both everything and nothing, that might make you kind of unsettled. You know, I'm the most important thing there is, but I can be wiped off the face of the earth at any point by conditions that surround me. One of them being the pandemic. You know, that's another reason I did this presentation. I have a background of the Black Death. Appropriate. So what does paranoia and conspiracy offer the individual? It offers a reconciliation of these contradictory elements, meaning it takes what's inaccessible in the totality and the subjectivity and experience and reconciles them by offering explanations. It presents a complete explanation of something. it's religious in its way. The reason we can identify conspiracy theories as false, not all of them are false, but it's usually the same way a cop would identify a lie in an interrogation, at least from what I see on television. If you want to lie, don't make your lie elaborate. In a recent show I watched, a woman had collected receipts from every stop she made, pristine, collected, in a way that was puzzling to the detectives because they thought nobody keeps receipts like this in perfect condition unless they're hiding something, which turned out she was. The thing about a conspiracy theory, as outlandish as it is that it makes sense. Every gap is filled, every link is accounted for, like an elaborate lie or an alibi. That's why someone like Sidney Powell can stand up there and make all these links, and she could, made a visual aid. It all originates with Hugo Chavez, though he's been dead 7 years. He constructed this machine and the software, which was then adopted in democratic cities and manipulated by leaders of those cities, and eventually resulted in this fraud. So what's insidious about this? I mean, it would be harmless if so many people weren't looking for this kind of reconciliation because of the subjective, I don't know if pain is the right word, but difficulties that they're in. They want a forced reconciliation. I'm going to skip some of this stuff because I don't think it's necessary. Get down to what I think are some of the causes of this, both causes that cannot be changed, but other causes that can be changed. I mean, when Sam introduced me, he said I was going to address whether or not we can escape from the clips of reason. Well, no, I'm not. I don't. What would I know? That just sounded good in the write-up. I don't know whether we will or not. That we could, but I can suggest things. The first problem with this paranoia and conspiracy theory is that it's rooted in the unchanging condition of human consciousness. Just bear with me for a second while I explain this briefly. And I take this idea from people like Sartre, who took it from other people, and the existentialists and the phenomenologists. Consciousness is an empty thing that applies itself to the world. Sartre says all consciousness is consciousness of something. Therefore, you're conscious of something. You never have an empty consciousness. Consciousness isn't material. It's intangible, but it applies to everything around it. So you're always going to be separate from the world because that's the way you perceive. You see a separation between yourself and the world because I see this coffee cup, but obviously I'm not the coffee cup. I'm something else. And it's hard to determine that. As social conditions change, it gets harder and harder. And the one philosopher that I've always turned to for explanations, because to me he seems to be the most relevant person even now, is a man named Theodor Adorno, who wrote primarily during the 30s up through the 60s, I believe. Still teaching in 68 during the student revolutions. And they thought he was too stodgy. He wasn't helping the revolution. They busted into his class and covered him in flowers. And of course, for this old German refugee from Hitler, this was rather upsetting didn't know what to make of this new force, unlike somebody like Marcuse who kind of embraced it. But he wrote a book about astrology in which he tried to understand the appeal of astrology. And it's the same appeal that conspiracies and paranoia have. And I mentioned the end of the world narratives. I don't talk much about that here, but they also provide like a total reconciliation in some way. I'll read this passage, so bear with me a little bit. The essay is called The Stars Down to Earth. What he did was read an astrology column from the Los Angeles paper for a year, I think. And he says, for a while, people recognize their dependence and often enough venture the opinion that they are pawns, it is extremely difficult for them to face this dependence unmitigated. Society is made up of those whom it comprises. If the latter would fully admit their dependence on man-made conditions, they would somehow have to blame themselves, would have to recognize not only their impotence, but also that they are the cause of this impotence, would have to take responsibility, which today are extremely hard to take. This may be one of the reasons why they like so much to project their dependence upon something else, be it a conspiracy of Wall Street bankers or the constellation of the stars. And I added George Soros, the World Order, the Green Deal, the UN, Agenda 21, or some kind of pedophile political nexus called QAnon. What drives people into the arms of the various kinds of prophets of deceit is not only their sense of dependence and their wish to attribute this dependence to some higher and ultimately more justifiable source, but it is also their wish to reinforce their own dependence, not to have to take matters into their own hands, a wish true, which is ultimately engendered by the pressure under which they live. Okay, and I'll skip the last part here, so I can take this next few minutes. This is in no way Adorno saying something like, take responsibility for yourself. It's hardly a philosopher of like self-help and personal responsibility. What he means is this is a subjective reaction to conditions which the individual puts on him or herself, but they're not responsible. Not responsible for the conditions of the totality, but you're made to feel that you are. It's in the interest of total systems to put the blame on you, and then you are the one who's at fault, and you must seek some sort of consolation in conspiracy or astrology or Oprah. And you are the one who fails or succeeds. So it eliminates the totality from the consideration entirely, which works very well for its purposes if you're anybody like me who's looking for social change. And I threw in here an old favorite of mine that nobody talks about, E. Debord, who wrote Society of the Spectacle in 1967. And to your question about Sartre, he calls the total system society of the spectacle, which is very hard to understand. It has both a conceptual dimension and almost a poetic dimension, but it seems to get across a great deal about how people experience things. And he says, the spectacle subjugates living men to itself, that the economy, the extent that the economy has totally subjugated them. is no more than the economy developing for itself. It is the true reflection of the production of things and the false objectification of producers. Now, there's a lot of things in Du Bois that you would take issue with as being rather perhaps simplistic, but which I think are useful. As commodities become more alive, people become more objectified. So what's the alternative to this? You have to reject anything that poses itself as a false reconciliation, conspiracy, paranoia, cultism. I include the occult generally, which I think is part of this, astrology, an example of that. Anything which reinforces this idea, that which appears as good, that which is good appears. The attitude which it demands in principle is passive acceptance, which in fact it already obtained by its manner of appearing without reply, by its monopoly of appearance. Meaning it hasn't reinforced passivity, it expresses the passivity that already exists that allows it to appear. So alternative reconciliations in a very vague way that might allow us to escape the false ones are putting us back in charge, people, technology, people and the economy, people and institutions, people and administration, people and environment, people and community. That's deliberately vague because you can think of that in your own way. It's more the case that this presentation identifies what is not reconciliation and characteristics that help you to identify it as false. And just to sum up, I included the Three Stooges as fascist leaders here. I included works cited that you may want to look up. I had meant to talk briefly about Beckett. And I think the motto for my presentation is, no one that ever lived ever thought so crooked as we. We do what we can, shouldn't. And then there's this long passage from Adorno, which you can read on your own. I can send it to anybody who requests it. I send it to Sam and he can send it out. This great story about the rabbits. Just briefly, the rabbits are being hunted. The hunter shoots at them and misses. And then he says, I understand the meaning of this to be, what would happiness be which did not measure itself according to the immeasurable sorrow of what is? For the course of the world is deeply unsettled. Whoever cautiously adapts to it partakes of its madness. Only the eccentric holds fast, commands the absurdity to fall. Which is why in many cases, conspiracy theorists are to be listened to, despite their absurdity. Only the latter may navigate the appearance of calamity, unreality of despair, and innovate from this, not merely that one still lives, but that there is still life. Cunning of the powerless hares redeems, along with themselves, even the hunters, whose guilt they pilfer because they shot at them and missed by accident. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. That I knew it would be fragmentary and more than I could get things over to Sam.
Well, thank you, Dr. Frisoli, for that talk. And at this point, we will move to questions and answers. So if anyone has a question, there's a few ways we can go about this. So if you would like to ask your question directly by unmuting and ask, please use the hand raising icon on Zoom. I'll be able to see that and we'll be able to call you. Or you can put your questions in chat. And as you do that, I'll see those questions and read them aloud for Dr. Frisoli to answer. So if anyone has any questions, this is your opportunity. And the first question here is from Dean Grubbs. And Dean Grubbs asks, are there any ebbs and flows of conspiracy theories?
Um, well, I'm not a historian, but I would think so. I mean, it never disappears because the desire for reconciliation is always there as a feature of both consciousness and social conditions. But I'd say as those conditions have become more totalizing, it has led to an increase in that. I mean, the entire basis of fascism is pretty much nothing but this false reconciliation based on conspiracy paranoia, one degree or the other, whether it's soft fascism or hard fascism, if you want to distinguish between the two. And I think now it's reaching another high point for some reason because of I don't know, I'm not going to pretend I know the causes, but one cause might be economic conditions which promise so much and have delivered so little, which are clearly in collapse. And the politics of liberalism, which is clearly in collapse as well. So I think that may be encouraging it. Well, I would say definitely could trace ebbing and flowing if you were so inclined. But I would suspect that in the 20th century, it's been on the increase, and in many ways that defines it.
And a question here from Natalie. Natalie asks, how do you think the pandemic has added to conspiracy theories and groups like QAnon?
Well, I think it seemed to arrive at just the right time for some reason. The perfect time because it reinforces them. And it also seems to guarantee their authenticity. That I'm not sure how to put this. It's a force in itself that the conspiracy theorists reject, but it's also capable of destroying, which is the kind of division that they're trying to overcome. So the way they overcome it is by adapting it to their previous conspiracies, like QAnon and all that, so that rather than an actual existing natural force, it becomes part of pre-existing conspiracies that authenticate them, prove them, and which is easy to adapt because it's can't see it. It fits right in with these discussions of leaders out of control and getting together to stop your freedom, and a weird conflation of economy with survival, which I'm not making light of. But, in a lot of discussions, there's a conflation between losing your business and losing your life, which is only possible now.
And, oops, sorry. I have to learn to unmute myself. Question
No,
from...
I give whole lessons.
Question from Dominique asking, is it that paranoia will necessarily lead to conspiracy theory? Is it possible to have one without the other? Or do you see the two as always being mutually exclusive, going hand in hand?
Because I think paranoid would necessarily have to identify forces that are out to get you. Now, the thing is, I've been accused of conspiracy theories because I talk about things like totalized economy and all that. I say, well, that's not conspiracy theory in the sense that I believe there's like the Illuminati getting together at the building. It's a conceptual, philosophical notion, but I think you could have them in different varieties. You know, the paranoia certainly varies, and Hofstadter identifies the foundation of Goldwaterism as this kind of paranoia, and then he gives the example of McCarthy. I think there would have to be some, but how elaborate it is, how well discussed it is up for grabs. And the real problem is whether it has the opportunity to be implemented, because fascism had the opportunity to implement it and make it to make a reality based on fundamental unreality. So if we see this moving toward a realization, that's where it's definitely a problem.
And almost an excellent follow up to that from Orlando. He says, so to sort of sum up, would you conclude that paranoia leads to a desire to reconciliate everything to quote unquote make sense to a particular individual? And would you say that this type of state of mind is overall detrimental or all right as long as they do not take action in the real world?
Well, I think it's certainly very comforting for a lot of people. So in that sense, it's not detrimental to them. Now, if it's not realized in any meaningful way, I don't see the harm of it, except to disengage you from reality to some degree. But it's not as if I have a monopoly on what reality is. But I think it has to be thought of as something other than the current psychiatric and psychological terms, which have become, to me anyway, rather simplistic and dependent on concepts that are far less rigid than they make them out to be. So certainly I think it's, for any individual, it's both a source of comfort and a source of discomfort. Discomfort, constantly agitated by this, comfort for the people who are so fully on board with their conspiracies that they're comfortable. And I didn't say anything about cults, but cults are a great example of this. People feel accepted in the community and welcome, and many of them talk about how much better they feel until typically collapses and they have to maintain their false reconciliation. There's still one of the Manson women out there who still believes in Charlie Manson. I forget her name. If you talk to her, she will still tell you, no, Charlie was right. She's never renounced him. And then, of course, there are the people who saw it as a trap and this phony false reconciliation, and was immensely regretful.
These are excellent questions. This one coming from one of our own, Professor Parks, asking a bit about whether Hofstadter here is a little bit of hypocrisy. He says, given that Hofstadter falsely condemned many of his academic colleagues as communist spies to the HUAC, which is at the time the House of Representatives Committee for Un-American Activities, and took money from the Fund of the Republic, which CIA cut out that funded anti-communist left publishing, in order to justify the basic claims of the anti-communist right. How should that impact the reception of Hofstadter's work? How is this use? How is the use of his theory not simply psychologizing lines of inquiry rather than taking the time to work through them? He gives an example. He says, many, I reckon, would have considered the idea of elite pedophiliac parties to be a paranoia until the court revelations of Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, I don't know that much about Hofstadter. Like I said, I was just kind of introduced to it. That's why you can't use him by himself. Say he's inadequate compared to a theorist like Adorno. He's nowhere near approaching the incisiveness of understanding these conditions, but he's very useful in making you aware of them. And my simplistic understanding is that a lot of these things happened later. I don't know if they're happening at the same time he was writing this, but what I've read so far is very effective in diagnosing this way of thinking. So the fact that he's compromised doesn't affect the usefulness of me, but the fact that he's pretty much, these are terrible things to have done, but he's still thought of as like a centrist liberal, and I'm not a centrist liberal, but I can read one and get something from it, just as a horror fan when he's right. In his talk last time, I can read H.P. Lovecraft and put aside the fact that he was a virulent, racist, creep, mama's boy. It's not a very good answer, but I think there's still a possibility of separating the writer from the work. And in terms of the Jeffrey Epstein thing, I would say all of these things have a connection to reality. Nothing can spring fully blown out of nothing. So the reason they make sense is because there's something there. There's something, like the Illuminati. Somebody's doing something. It may not be a group of 12 people, including Beyonce, for some reason, who get together and make these decisions, but somebody's making decisions. And the weird thing is, you can go to the Illuminati website and join, which strikes me as undermine the whole idea of the Illuminati. That's true, Jeffrey Epstein, but it's not the truth of QAnon. Obviously, elaborating.
A number of questions asking about conspiracy theories, I think, in their nature. So I'm going to combine them here. Lauren posts an example. Her question is, would you say conspiracy theories are important in making major choices? And the example she cites here, she says, with the elections, conspiracy theorists say that the elections were rigged. Therefore, the security and counting was more heavily monitored in many ways that ensures that those theories were wrong. And so combining that example with her question of are conspiracy theories important in making major choices, but also a few questions here about whether conspiracy theories alone are good or bad, and what do they threaten to change the structure of how the world and the society operates?
I don't know if I understand. I don't understand the election.
I think the question here, and Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the idea was that because of the conspiracy theories, about the election being rigged and QAnon and so forth, ended up there being more scrutiny paid to the count, which then ultimately led to more solid evidence, if you will, dismissing that kind of conspiracy. And so her question is, do conspiracy theories play a role in making major choices like that?
If I can add just on the question,
Please, Lauren.
like the conspiracy theories bring up these ideas that the elections are rigged. They bring up ideas. They surface these ideas that this can happen because of this, or this is happening due to these, like, so that's why the security and the counting is more heavily monitored, because those conspiracy theories brought it to light, like, and that is why those there was more security, there was recounting, because conspiracy theorists were like, hey, this is wrong, it's all rigged, you need to redo it, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that would be a case by case situation. Since you're always in the midst of it, it's very possible to take something seriously that you know is untrue and still make something good from that. For instance, if the philosophical basis of the conspiracies and the paranoia is this false reconciliation, and let's give the example of astrology or the occult, I could move you into other ways of thinking that connect to the occult, but leave aside its falsity, its unreality. So yeah, definitely, I can see it as a positive force, but typically in reaction to it, and it's already gotten some kind of hold. So it would perhaps be best if it didn't have it, but nobody can control that. And as long as there are people trying to make sense of things and being unable to, they will develop conspiracy theories, and the response to them can very well be helpful, I imagine, as in the election example. Or I listen to a lot of, well, not anymore, but I used to listen to a lot of Art Bell, if any of you know who that is. He had a late night radio show which was devoted to aliens, alien abduction, Bigfoot, any kind of paranormal activity. And this belief in aliens, for example, could possibly have a positive outcome in our understanding of our place cosmically, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? Like it can definitely console someone, but it can even have a social significance. Part of the aspect of alien conspiracies is that there's a big push on the government to be transparent, to release all these documents it's compiled, including things like the Kennedy investigation. The hell haven't you released documents that are 57 years old? So that element of it is positive. Now, I'm not trying to condemn them or praise them. I'm trying to find out where they come from. Mm-hmm. And they certainly exist on a spectrum of harmful to harmless.
We have time for one final question here, and I think this goes along with that answer. It says, recently there has been talks about a quote-unquote great reset in which the way our economy works will be changed forever. This act is spearheaded by the World Economic Forum and is in the beginning stages in Europe. Conspiracy theorists have been warning about something like this. On what scale would you say something like COVID-19 would be the reason for this?
that COVID-19 is the reason for it?
Mhm.
Well, like I said before, because it's absorbed into the total explanation.
Mhm.
And at its extremes, I only know a little bit about this, but they've been going on about the New World Order and globalism for many, many years now. That was a bugaboo of John Birch's society. Was, globalism, one of them. I think it reinforces it because somehow it's been recast into like a foreign affliction. Like it's not merely a virus, which has neither morals or consciousness or any kind of will whatsoever, but it's been given that by these conspiracy theorists, and it reinforces the idea that what is going to happen is we are going to lose our autonomy as Americans, not to our own problems, not to widespread decay of the infrastructure, not to an economic system that's not sustainable, not to widespread illness among aging boomers. None of these things will cause that decline. What will cause it is a dominance by an outside force represented by the globalists and their interest in this economic reset, whatever that might be. And then people always say, well, then you'll wind up like Europe. I don't know what's that bad about Europe, but it means something to them that I don't know quite what it means. And I think what they're unaware of is the connection of their globalist conspiracies to the anti-Jewish conspiracies from which they arose. They've now rejected anti-Semitic part of it, but they retained the globalist, cosmopolitan, rootlessness, lack of nationalism aspect of them, and adopted them.
All right, very good. It is 12 noon, and so we'll draw this conversation to a pause. I say pause because I know there are a lot of great questions, and certainly would welcome your follow-up. And so, again, Dr. Michael Frisoli, thank you, Michael, for joining us and for this talk. Certainly a fascinating interest to me. I work in the political world, and the conspiracy theories are running rampant, and so I deeply appreciate this. Thank you, Dr. Frisoli.
Thank you. And if anybody didn't get their question answered or wants a copy of the presentation as fragmentary and incoherent as it might be, which includes the videos that I wasn't able to show you, just send me an email, which is mfrisoli@Northampton.
And I'm going to put his email in the chat right now, and so you can see that and reach out directly to Dr. Frisoli. Again, Dr. Frisoli teaches in our English department here, so those of you who need to take English 1 and 2 or interested in film, he is a great faculty member that you can engage with all semester long, and so we certainly invite you to do that.
That either encouraged you or discouraged
you. One or the other. I just want to thank all of you for joining us. And our next Spartan Talk, we're going to wrap up the semester next Thursday, the Thursday after Thanksgiving on December the 3rd with a special edition. I will be joined by Professor Rob Hayes of our journalism department, and we're going to have a two-way conversation on looking forward post-election 2020. And we'll be wrapping up, and we've got a number of great talks ready to go for the spring. And so super excited, and really hope all of you will join us again next Thursday, and then as well as in the spring semester. Now, look, if you have a faculty member that you really love taking class with and you want to do a Spartan Talk, please reach out to us. You can either email myself at schen@northampton.edu or Dean Patrick Grubbs at pgrubbs@northampton.edu, and let us know who they are. We're always looking for new speakers for Spartan Talks. And then lastly, just want to wish all of you a very, very wonderful and blessed Thanksgiving. And look forward to seeing you next week on December the 3rd for our final Spartan Talk of the fall semester. With that, we'll draw this to a close. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the week.